Finance and Revenue is open. Good morning, everyone. Full agenda today. Here's the order we're going to go in. We're going to start with House Bill 3188, then go to 3542, then 2723, and then a work session on Senate Bill 663 and possibly a Senate Bill 80. So let's start then with a public hearing on House Bill 3188. Give us a briefing, please, before we get going. Senator Roblin, Representative McEwen, and her team.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, House Bill 3188 comes through the Senate Environment and Natural Resource Committee. On the House side, it was in the House Ag and Natural Resource Committee. It would authorize landowners who make up at least 50% of the land area in the district to petition for the formation of a predator damage control district within a county. It modifies the definition of predatory animals somewhat. Includes bears, bobcats, and red foxes, in addition to the usual predatory animal list of black bears, cougars, fur-bearing mammals, gray wolves, coyotes, rabbits, rodents, and birds. It requires the county commissioners to appoint an advisory board for the newly formed predator damage control districts, and establishes presumptive charges of $1 per acre for tax lots of 10 or more acres and a $25 flat fee for tax lots with less than 10 acres. It would allow landowners to elect whether to incur the charge for predator control, and requires the board to submit a list of those landowners electing to incur the charges. And it requires the county to certify the list of landowners paying the charges so that they may receive services from the county to prevent, reduce, or mitigate damage from predatory animals in the district. The revenue impact is indeterminate. It really depends on the number of control districts that are established, also the rates that are charged, and that would ultimately be variable. Also, there is a minimal fiscal impact on the bill.
Thank you. Morning.
Good morning, Chair Haas.
From sand dune districts to red foxes.
That's right.
Chair Haas, members of the committee, thank you for having us here today to consider House Bill 3188 with the -3 amendments. I have with me my colleagues who are also very interested in this bill moving forward. This is a bill that began work about a year ago with Senator Roblin and myself in Coos County. Became apparent that Douglas County was working on a parallel bill, so we have combined efforts to try and provide some services to our ranchers and our farmers and our landowners in Coos and Douglas County that have issues with predation. The reason this bill is before you is because we have a couple of counties who are financially in difficult straits because of the secure rural schools issue that we're all very familiar with. Predation, wildlife predator control, is funded by a number of sources in our counties. The money comes from the USDA, the Oregon Department of Ag, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and historically county money was a part of that. And in our counties who are financially struggling now, that money is no longer available. So what you see here is an effort by our private landowners to come forward and self-fund their portion of the predator control management services that are historically provided by the county in conjunction with the other sources of funding that are used for this issue. I think it's a wonderful way for our landowners to participate, to help our counties with the financial struggles that they have. They have come forward in a very prescribed way, gone through a long process to try and figure out the best way to form a predator control district that they can self-fund. And I think it's a wonderful solution to a problem that has a very long identifiable history in our counties where agriculture and timber are important. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I could go on for some time about the details of this, but we've been through a number of iterations already. This did come through the House with 56 votes. 2 noes and a couple of excused votes. We've been through a number of committees, so I don't want to belabor the details unless you want to hear them. My colleagues here are, I'm sure, delighted to jump in and answer questions if you have specifics, or I think we have Mr. Phillips from Department of Revenue and Mr. Dale online watching if we have questions of LC about why we ended up with the proposal that we have right here. We think it's simple. We think it's clean. It's set up like a forest protective district where they self-fund, and it's at the discretion of the county to determine when these people come forward if they can form a district and spend their own money to supplant money that the counties no longer have.
Name for the record, Mr. Chair.
Mm-hmm.
Did you identify yourself, Representative McKeon?
I am
Did
so
you?
sorry. I did not. Chair Hass, my apologies. I'm Kathy McEwen. I represent House District 9.
Gentlemen, did you want to? You did a great job.
Less is more.
I'll just, for the record, Arnie Roblin, Senate District 5. This is a big issue in ours. If you talk to the revenue people, you'll understand why it's not just a pilot project for a few. It has to do with the taxing structure and how we have to do things. I don't think many will go, other counties will go through the process which is embedded here. It has a little longer sunset than many just because it's going to take a year to 2 years to get it all set up, to get the landowners to buy in, to decide if they want to do it and whatever. So the first couple of years will be organization. The last we'll see how it works. Our goal, for most of us, the coyote population is probably the one that creates the most interface problems and also causes problems with a lot of the other wildlife and the stuff we're trying to raise. There are other predators that cause other kinds of problems for landowners like forestry and bears and a bunch of other things. But this basically doesn't change anything that we're doing anywhere except for who pays for it. And it allows this group to come together and do that. And with that, any questions you might have?
Representative?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dallas Hurd, representative for House District 2. As Representative McEwen talked about, this issue was brought to me actually while I was on the campaign trail running for office through former Representative Freeman and by some of the ranchers and farmers in our community. As she said, Douglas and Coos counties, just to name two, are some of the southern Oregon counties that are poverty-stricken. Their budgets are increasingly shrinking. Their funding sources are continuously going away. Hopefully that'll turn around at some point, but right now in the foreseeable future, it's not. It's going to continue. And so we're talking about $170,000 to $175,000 per county that they're actually putting into the pot currently on these existing services. Keep in mind, this is an existing program of existing services to maintain population control of predators so that it doesn't overly impact. And it's still, even with those services, is impacting these property owners, but it would just get completely out of control within a matter of a couple of years if this system is allowed to collapse. Just to give you some numbers, and then I'll let you go, we're talking about $150 million in gross domestic product between the two counties as far as timber, cattle, sheep, all that kind of direct business surrounding that. We're talking about $30 million of potential lost sales to those individuals in the coming years if we do let this program cease to exist. So I highly encourage you to support it. It's a good bill, and it's really a simple bill. Oh, and finally, if I may, it's purely voluntary. They can opt out, they can opt back in, they can opt out again. No one has to do this.
And just to reiterate, this won't change what historically have been controls on predators, predatory behavior. It's just finding a different way, as you said, Representative, to supplant the money.
Yep.
In essence, what this does is it takes the burden of funding off of the county and puts it on the landowner.
Questions? Senator Bertschiger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure this is not limited to just certain counties. This is statewide.
Statewide. We tried. We thought about a pilot project. We've had conversations. Our certified smart people here said you can't really do that kind of stuff with the tax structure. You've got to. So that's why it's everybody.
Good.
Senator Boquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm fully supportive of the bill. I don't actually have a problem on my ranch in northeastern Oregon. The wolves have eaten all of the coyotes. And the smugglers, the Chinese smugglers for aphrodisiac have wiped out my bear population. So if this bill does fail on the Senate floor, you're more than welcome to have my wolves and smugglers from my area.
Thank you, Senator.
Further questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Jenny Pressler and Jane Nigger.
That was Jane Miller, right?
Well, I can't read your writing, Jane.
Yeah, sorry.
but I think it is Jane Miller now that you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Chair House, members of the committee, my name is Jenny Dressler, and I represent the Oregon Farm Bureau, and I'm here today to testify in strong support of House Bill 3188. You heard from the legislative panel before me about the mechanics of this program. I'll give you a little background. Oregon Farm Bureau came into this discussion maybe 3 or 4 years ago when both Douglas and Coos counties were considering how they would continue to fund their predator control services, usually provided by USDA, Wildlife Services, going forward, were they to lose that county funding. After 3 or 4 years around a table at Sizzlers, I think the landowners were able to come to an agreement looking at models in other states as to how they would create a voluntary system to allow folks to opt in and fund their own services. This program is especially important as federal timber payments continue to decrease. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer about the expanded definition of predators, which is meant to address the USDA Wildlife Services that are funded through the county program. But I would just strongly ask for your support of this bill, and I'm available for any questions you might have. So.
Any questions for Jenny Pressler from the Oregon Farm Bureau? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity to be able to communicate with you this morning. My name is Jane Miller. I'm a director of Oregon Cougar Action Team, which is a 501c3 educational foundation. I am a cattle rancher. I grew up here on our family's 7,000-acre cattle ranch in eastern Oregon. My brother is Tony Flagg. He oversees United Grain and wheat growing here in Oregon, and I'm still ranching today. I'm against this bill primarily because, according to Oregon law, it has to follow statutory law. And from what I understand, ORS 488166, ORS 497.655 are referred to in House Bill 3188B. And there are serious flaws in the relationships of these ORSs with what the bill is referencing. Predatory animals are clearly defined in ORS 610.002. That definition does not include black bears, cougars, fur-bearing mammals, and gray wolves. In fact, what it does include are swine, coyotes, rabbits, rodents, and birds only. 61.003 has bobcat and red fox. There are errors in how this bill is written. It's not following the letter of the law. It's the inclusion of these animals in ORS 497.655B as game mammals with limited populations, bears and cougars in particular, should never be included in a government-funded removal program such as those allowed under ORS Chapter 610, Predatory Animals. Furthermore, these animals, the management of our wildlife should never be privatized. It needs to stay in federal and government protection. This sounds like a plan that's stepping towards privatizing our wildlife services. These ranchers are ranchers. I'm a rancher. I'm not a biologist or a scientist. I go to the biologists and the scientists for the information to keep my soils healthy, my watersheds healthy, and a balanced ecosystem. That includes these predators, the cougars, the wolves, and the other issues here. My dad told me, take care of the land and the land will take care of you. And he didn't allow hunting on our ranch. As a response to that, we had a very balanced ecosystem, healthy soil for our cattle. And we didn't lose any of our 1,000 head a year that we ran to poachers. We lost them to cattle rustlers. We lost them to poachers. We didn't lose them to cougar or to wolves or anything like that. We lost them to human acts. So my concerns are that this bill is just a moneymaker. It's not investing itself in science. There's no science attached to this bill. There's no Professor William Ripple, no Dr. Beccia, no Christina Eisenberg, nothing out of Oregon State University to talk to us about the trophic cascade, the destruction of our ecosystems when we turn goats and cattle out there and expunge all the natural predators. I don't see a balance happening in this. We're looking at a monetary value only, and we're not looking at the long run, what it's really going to cost us if we expunge those predators from the ecosystem. I know they're not as big a threat to my operation as hunters coming by and killing my cattle, or pet domestic dogs. I've lost 30 head of my sheep to pet domestic dogs. I just sold my bull to a farmer who gave up raising sheep because he couldn't deal with the dogs. So we're not addressing real issues out there. We're not addressing the fact that this isn't even following the ORSs accurately. By law, we're breaking the law by writing this bill. It's a flawed bill, not only with the science, not only with the land use ethics, but it's not following the ORSs at all. It's inaccurate. It's wrong. We cannot pass a bill like this. We keep building bills on flawed science. No science, junk science. We don't turn to the professionals for the science. We turn to those who have vested interest, who think they know and understand what they're talking about, but they don't. They have financially vested interests. They're not separated from that. And you cannot make good decisions when you are financially invested. You have to be able to make decisions, the really painful decisions, based on science, and make those sacrifices. We maybe can't run as many head of cattle out there. Maybe we're going to lose some of the cattle. Maybe we should raise buffalo. They're predator resistant, and they don't need as much feed as cattle do, or as much water. Maybe we need to start looking at a better way to manage our land instead of just passing killing laws that strip the ecosystems of what we need. This is a bad law. It's not based on sound science, and it's based on flawed. It's based on flawed ORSs. It's not written well. We need to follow the law. We need to look at the details of that law, and we need to have more science in this bill. We have to stop passing bills that are mistakes. This particular bill references 497.655. For the last couple of years, I've tried to get that ORS corrected because it's not referencing the animals in there accurately. ORS 610.002 has the correct definition, and we're not following that. We're writing whatever we want to write, whatever ORS feels good for the moment, and we can't just do that anymore. And so I would appreciate it if we would not pass this bill until we do further research work into the science and we relate to the ORSs accurately, because right now they're not accurate, and that's not good policy making here in Oregon. Thank you.
Thank you. You've made some claims there that the proposed legislation is inconsistent with existing statutes.
Yes.
So let me turn to Christine about some of those claims for kind of a initial inquiry response.
Sure, Mr. Chair. So the measure refers to 497.655, which is a kind of a core group of predatory animals, and then 497.655 refers itself to 610002. So we'll start with kind of think of it as a core. In 610002, it says predatory animals include feral swine, coyotes, rabbits, rodents, and birds. Then 497.655 refers to 610002, and then adds black bears, cougars, fur-bearing mammals, and gray wolves. And then the measure here refers to 497.655, which then is everything in 497.655 plus bears, bobcats, and red foxes. So each time the list is added to a bit, but the core definition of predatory animals was 610002, but then things were added in each layer, so to speak.
Well, that...
So, excuse me. So,
okay.
So those claims don't hold up under your initial review?
Well, I think that it's pretty typically seen that each chapter of the ORS can define things however they kind of like to. So it's more of a policy question whether there is this list is expanded or not. But I think it there's not necessarily a legal problem with it, and it might be more of a policy decision.
Sure, question, staff. Follow up to
Senator Boquist?
Am I not correct? Because I had legislative counsel in my office on this particular bill, which mimics exactly what you just said. So my question is, though, this has been through both of the Natural Resource Policy Committees. And then, of course, was it referred to the House Revenue for a revenue? I mean, we're the Revenue and Finance. Did it go to House Revenue and Finance too?
I believe not.
No, so we're actually looking at it from the House, from the Finance and Revenue perspective. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Further questions?
May I add something?
Yes.
I'd like to also verify that the 497.655 is communicating about voluntary remuneration. It's not communicating about the specifics and the biology and the demographics of a mammal. That is in ORS, specifically 610.002. Those responsibilities fall into the description of that bill as a catalyst for any other bill.
Answer to that. I'll take that as an inquiry to our staff here.
Yeah, because ORS 497.655 is only describing voluntary contributions. It's not describing the wildlife. That's not its purpose. It's a purpose of monetary value only, and the biology belongs to 610.002.
All right, we'll take that as a comment, and we'll look into it.
Thank you.
Further questions? Thank you. Thank you both. Anyone else here to testify on House Bill 3188? Seeing none, I'm going to close the public hearing on
Thank you for your time.
3188. And I will open up a public hearing on House Bill 3542. Representative Leininger and Whitsitt are here. Paul, Dr. Warner will do a quick briefing on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. House Bill 3542 came through House Revenue Committee and has been assigned directly to Senate Finance and Revenue. It essentially does two things. One is in Section 2 of the bill, it in the case of a bill that creates a tax credit or expands a tax credit, it requires the chief sponsor proponent shall submit to a legislative committee related to revenue the purpose of that credit or the purpose of the expansion of that credit. And secondly, in Section 3, it directs our office, Legislative Revenue Office, to prepare a list of all tax credits that have revenue impact in the most recent tax year, and then highlights those that have had a revenue impact that exceeds our initial estimates by 10% or more. We would highlight these and bring these out in a report prepared under ORS 173.025, which was House Bill 2002, you recall from last session. That's what required us to issue a biennial report on all expiring tax credits, plus additional credits that the Revenue Committee would want us to examine, so that it would fit within the context of that report.
Okay, Representative.
Good morning, Chair Haas and committee members. I'm Gail Whitsitt. I represent House District 56, which is the southern half of Klamath and Lake counties. And today we're bringing you a bill that has, in our opinion, a great potential to improve the tax credit system in Oregon as we know it. House Bill 3542 would require that the chief sponsor of any legislative measure that creates or expands a tax credit to have a specific revenue report drafted. It's a straightforward bill. It can be easily implemented with little cost to the state, but perhaps provide increased savings to the people. It should help separate the good credits from those that are not so beneficial. And the report would require the following: the public policy purpose of the tax credit, the anticipated timeline for achieving the purpose of the tax credit, the best means of measuring the effectiveness of the credit, who will benefit from the credit, and the effectiveness of the credit in benefiting its targets. The report should also include the expected results if the credit expires, information on other states doing a similar tax credit, whether a credit is the most effective or efficient way to achieve the stated goal of the credit, the administrative cost. The report should also look at whether direct appropriation would be more efficient and list other incentives that are available in this state and that have similar goals. This report will help legislators tasked with the tough decisions on how to allocate funds make a more informed decision on whether or not a certain tax credit is needed or if the intended goal can be achieved in another way. I think it's a great bill, having set on revenue, for one session now. We see a lot of tax credits, and not all of them turn out the way that we are expecting. And I think this would really help to define, before we put that into statute, what it's going to do for us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Haas and members of the committee. I'm Ann Leininger, and I represent House District 38. I'm really pleased to be here today with my good friend and colleague, Representative Whitsitt. This bill meets the need that we on the House Revenue Committee have perceived of having clear information about the purpose and sort of how we'll measure the effectiveness of any contemplated expanded or new tax credit. And one of the things that makes it a fairly simple solution is that what it does is take language that is already required to be included in the report that you look at to decide if you want to extend the sunset of a tax credit, and it puts it in an upfront requirement that that the proponent has to articulate those things in advance in terms of what their expectations are. So evidently right now the Legislative Revenue Office has to sometimes construct based on context and what they perceive to be the case, what the purpose of the tax credit was and how its effectiveness can be measured and whether it's the best approach. But this would put a requirement on the person who's seeking, or the team that's seeking to have the tax credit created or expanded, to do their part of articulating on the front end what they think those answers are, and it will enable the Legislative Revenue Office to be more effective at calibrating whether the tax credit worked as desired. Another thing about it is you folks, I think, passed this in 2013. That's when the initial requirement for how assessments for extensions would be done. So it really builds on the good work that you've done in the past to try to streamline and make more clear our intentions when we look at tax credits. We encourage your support.
Thank you. Appreciate both of you working on this. Senator Boquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree 110% with you, but I have a trick question.
I will go to her.
Right.
Yeah. Not.
Well, I think, that's good. She's junior by like 6 or 7 months or something like that, right? So that's a good way to do this. But interesting enough, I mean, we already have an ORS, and we already have a law that says that we legislators, when we submit a bill request after it's drafted to the Secretary of the Senate or to the Clerk of the House, we're required by law to put down who the proponent is or who the requester is, which then tells us, like, for example, if, the Widget Society wants a tax credit on widgets, right? We know it came from the Widget Society, and we can kind of track what you're trying to accomplish here and say, where did this come from? What do we think their intention was, so on and so forth. And then we already have that law.
Which will be
I follow that law religiously, and I get the daylights beat out of me politically. However, 75% of this legislature, the 90 members, ourselves, ignore it, don't do it, and we're all in the mystery category many times of wondering who did it, where did this come from, why is it so on and so forth. So my question is, if we pass this law that says when you put the request in, you're supposed to do this, how are we going to make the 90 of us, me including, do this?
Chair Haas.
I thought you were going to pass it to her.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right.
Chair Haas and Boquist, I defer to my colleague.
Well, it's going to be the law, and so we aren't going to let the bill go forward without this information. That would be my response. Let's follow the law. If we put it into statute, then we don't work any of these bills that don't have the appropriate information.
Follow up, Mr. Chair. I guess my point is we don't enforce the first law, right? And I think to save everybody there, I think generally speaking, most everybody here, because we work together, they do this, right? But there is just a large swath of members who forget maybe unintentionally forget. Right.
Well,
Yeah, it is a law. It is a law, yeah.
We might look at it this way. If we require 10 things, maybe we'll get 3, which would be 3 more than if we required
Good
one.
answer. I'm with you on that.
There you go.
3's better than none. So.
Right.
So, and I'd like to add to that, please, Senator Haas or Chair Haas and Senator Boquist. One of the things that this bill would require is that it be written down, that information be reduced to writing. So instead of information that has to be, articulated and it could get lost in the record and be hard to retrieve, this actually would require the proponent or a member of the committee that is filing it as a committee bill to give the information to the chief revenue officer, who then has to put it into the revenue report. So it'll be really clear if it's not there, and then it'll be, I suppose, up to good folks like you and tenacious House Revenue Committee members like us to, note when we don't see it, if we don't see it, and say that that's a problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Several of us on this committee sat on House Revenue as well for a few years and understand the need for this. And like the good senator at the other end of the bench, I wonder how we're going to make sure this happens, and furthermore, how we make sure that what the proponent says is accurate.
Well, I would say that's always an aspect of working in this building. We just have to we have to take it on faith and investigate as representatives, and then ask the hard questions, I guess.
Unfortunately, we have the good doctor in revenue, House Revenue, that can tell us if it's accurate. So,
Senator Haas and Chair Haas and Senator Riley, I agree with you that with Dr. Warner as our Chief Revenue Officer, we're in really good hands in terms of getting good information, and it is our responsibility to ask in exploratory questions. And then until Representative Whitsett and I get booted off the House Revenue Committee for being just too difficult, until then you can rely that we will ask those questions, because we tend to ask a lot of questions on tax credit issues. Yeah.
And it's really, I think we're all supportive of the bill, but it's an excellent point because there's so much subjectivity to this. And not only that, there's a philosophical difference in one person's unnecessary tax break is an incentive for industry somewhere else. And you might not like my tax break, but it's my incentive. So you tend to get some of that.
Yeah.
But I think this will help. Further questions? Okay, representatives, thank you very much for your work on this. Marcia Kelly, did you want to weigh in on this?
I bet she likes this.
Chair Haas and members of the committee, I'm Marcia Kelly, and today I'm representing both the Oregon Women's Rights Coalition, for whom I lobby, and the Human Services Coalition of Oregon, because I'm part of the new leadership over the summer and going into next year. HISCO feels that this bill is consistent with our fairness in tax policy, transparency, and clarity. To answer Senator Riley's question, there are people like myself who have been working on tax credits since 2001 who try to raise these issues if they're not included in the legislation to begin with. And the second part of the bill, in looking at the expected costs and whether hopefully it's achieving what it needs to achieve, is also important. I will bring to your attention one of the tax credits you're considering this year as you're going forward, and that's the new market tax credit. It has a $16 million limit. The reporting is done through Business Oregon. And if you look at the report and then calculate the wages that have come in for the jobs created by that tax credit, for that $16 million a year, we have wages of about $31 million. That sounds good, but if you take the average of 6.7 for people paying income taxes in Oregon for that $16 million a year credit, we're getting $2.1 million in income taxes. that sort of clarity needs to be in bills when they go forward so that we can make sure that they are achieving the purpose that they're supposed to achieve, rather than maybe making direct appropriations. I would also say that this is somewhat similar to having performance measures in the Ways and Means process. Things get looked over. Achievements are supposed to have, you're supposed to achieve the performance measures that are put forward for spending processes, and this could be something similar to that, except that it's on the other end of the building. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Any questions? Thank you, Marcia.
You're welcome.
All right. I'm going to close the public hearing on House Bill 3542 and open up a work session on House Bill 3542.
Mr. Chair, move House Bill 3542 to the floor. Will pass.
Senator Boquist moves House Bill 3542 to the floor of the Oregon State Senate with a do pass recommendation. Any discussion? Any objections? Seeing none, House Bill 3542 goes to the floor of the Oregon State Senate with a do pass recommendation. We are up to Senator Riley, if you would like to carry this bill. Okay. Close the work session on Senate Bill 3542 and open up a public hearing on House Bill 2723.
Yeah.
This is an interesting.
We're sending it somewhere. I don't know where. At this point.
Urban agriculture.
Urban agriculture incentive.
Rooftop light agriculture, is that what you said?
All right. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. House Bill 2723. We have the B engrossed version, also have a -B5 amendment, which I'll get to in a second. It's more of a technical change. But so House Bill 2723 B engrossed, it would allow a city or a county to designate an urban agricultural incentive zone. Cities are allowed to designate zones within city boundaries, and then counties are allowed to designate zones within county boundaries that are outside of cities. So the city or the county may enter into an agreement. It is a permissive, the bill is permissive, but so the city or the county may enter into an agreement with an owner of unimproved land with a designated urban agricultural incentive zone if the owner agrees to restrict the use of the unimproved land to small-scale agricultural production for 5 consecutive years. The bill defines agricultural production as employment of land for farm use and does not mean growing, harvesting, or processing marijuana. During each year of 5-year agreement, unimproved land is to be specially assessed in the same manner as farmland, provided the gross income requirements are met. It does specify the minimum and maximum cumulative land sizes per landowner at 5,000 square feet minimum and a maximum of 5 acres. It allows a county or a city to enter into a subsequent 5-year special assessment agreements with owners of unimproved land. And it does specify oversight responsibility for lands annexed to go to the city. So if a city annexes land that's previously in a county but outside of the city, and then the city annexes it, then the city becomes the oversight, local government oversight. It does allow special assessment to continue following transfer of title of land if the requirements continue to be met. It does require an application for special assessment, and it is to be received by the county assessor on or before April 1st, preceding the first property tax year for which the special assessment is sought, and it requires the assessor to accept or reject that application. Department of Revenue is required to prescribe the application forms and has rulemaking authority. And the bill also specifies criteria causing disqualification from special assessment and requires, in cases of disqualification, that there be a payment of additional tax equal to the difference in the tax that would have been paid and the tax that was paid as the property is being specially assessed. If a property meets the full 5-year, if the property is used in the full all 5 years as the farmland, then it would not be considered disqualified. So if in years 1 to 5, the unimproved land is used for farmland, it'll receive that special assessment in year 6. If they don't enter into another agreement, then the land no longer has to be farmed, or it could be developed or any other use, and it wouldn't have a clawback provision. This would apply to property tax years beginning on or after July 1st, 2016. And it prohibits, there's two sunset dates, so it prohibits a city or a county from designating urban agricultural incentive zones on or after January 1st, 2019. And then it prohibits any land from being specially assessed under this on or after July 1st, 2023. So that gives that 5 years. If you enter in, you still can have those final 5 years. So there's a sunset effectively July 1st, 2023. The B5 amendment, as I alluded to, it doesn't make any, the change is really, it removes the exclusion of growing, harvesting, or processing marijuana from the definition of agricultural production, but then later in the amendment, it prohibits unimproved land from qualifying for special assessment if unimproved land is used to grow, harvest, or process marijuana. So it's really just a change in semantics, more or less. The actual policy change would still prohibit using, harvesting or growing marijuana and qualifying for this special assessment. And we do have the paperwork. I'd be happy to talk about that if we go to a work session.
Okay, this bill has gone through the Rural Agriculture Committee in the House, passed the House floor, to the Natural Resources Committee here, and then referred to this committee. This is the first time it's been before a Revenue Committee. Ivan Molesky is here. If he can come up and maybe give us an idea of what we're trying to do.
All right, Chair Haas, members of the committee, for the record, Ivan Molesky with Friends of Family Farmers. We've been supporting this bill throughout the process. I've also worked pretty closely with a number of stakeholders on various amendments to kind of get it into the shape it is in. It's my understanding that there really is no direct revenue or fiscal impact because it is a local option, essentially. You have a city or county being able to designate a zone in which a lower tax rate could be provided for farms provided, or for land being used for agriculture from 5,000 square feet at the small end to 5 acres at the high end, and in which those landowners enter into 5-year agreements to allow that land to be farmed. The issue here, and we've submitted testimony, so there's testimony both on the B engrossed bill in OLS, but we submitted earlier testimony, which is also up on OLS and a fact sheet as well. You know, the bigger picture here is that urban agriculture is something that's growing. You know, we've seen a huge explosion in farmers markets across the state. You know, testimony was submitted from the manager of the Albany and Corvallis Farmers Market, for example, some farms in Portland. And so what you're seeing is folks are actually able to make a little bit of money on urban settings, lands that have not yet been developed. This land does not, I want to make clear, this land doesn't take land out of the development pool. It doesn't, you know, affect buildable land possibilities. It simply is really what can be done to encourage urban agriculture when land is not yet developed inside of urban areas. So think of vacant lots, think of areas that are maybe particularly large yards, these kinds of things. And so we've tried to structure it very similarly to the existing farm tax deferrals that are available for non-EFU lands in terms of both the income requirement. But the major difference is really, unlike the existing farm tax deferral for non-EFU lands, you qualify much more quickly for this. So rather than having to show income for 3 years, you can show income for 1 year. Another key difference from the existing tax deferral is that there's the only way you can be disqualified. Let me back up a second. Under the existing farm deferral for non-EFU lands, once you stop farming, it stops showing that income, you owe back taxes for several years. In this case, as long as you met your 5-year agreement, if you stop farming after that 5 years, there's no clawback provision. So it's essentially a break. However, if you do break the 5-year agreement, you decide that you're a landowner and you decide that, hey, you know, this developer has made me an offer I can't refuse on a subdivision and I'm going to break the 5-year farming agreement, then you would owe back taxes because you'd have actually broken the agreement. So we've one of the key pieces, I guess, one of the questions that we had during the process was to kind of create the sunset. So you'll notice there are 2 sunsets in there. One is essentially a 3-year period under which a local government could actually designate these zones. So that would be sort of the window that a local government would have to decide, is this something we want to use in a part of town that maybe is sort of, if you will, doesn't have access to a lot of local fresh food, or is just sort of sitting there vacant, not being used. Is this something we want to create at all? So there's that 3-year period. The second period is really allowing for these 5-year agreements to play out with the landowners, assuming that, let's say, a local city did not adopt a zone until right close to the deadline in 2019, then that 5-year agreement could be in effect until the second sunset. Another key provision, so that was a key issue. I also want to flag Section 1.6 is where we make clear that this is really only for tax purposes. This isn't this isn't a land use issue. This isn't intended to affect buildable land inventories or urban growth boundaries. This is really solely for the assessment of the taxes that a city could designate these zones. So we think that's made clear in Section 1.6. The last key piece I wanted to say, we worked with the Farm Bureau specifically on the -5 amendment. It is a technical amendment. That is, again, how you deal with the issue of growing, processing, and harvesting marijuana. While marijuana is going to be pretty heavily regulated in this state, it is going to be an accepted agricultural crop. So rather than specifically say it's not an agricultural crop in this context, we just want to make clear that these, we've changed how we dealt with it in the bill to say that if a city is going to designate one of these zones, we're talking about food production here primarily, we don't want the tax break to be applied for growing, harvesting, processing marijuana. So that's really what the technical amendment in -5 is. So I'd be happy to answer any other questions, but that's really where it's at. As you noted, it's passed the two policy committees, and to my knowledge, there's not a direct revenue impact. So we urge your support. Thank you.
Ivan, could you back up to give us a better perspective on exactly who will benefit from this, who will use this?
Sure, Chair Haas, members of the committee. In some of the written testimony that was submitted earlier in the process, it was noted there's a growing number of urban farms. Not a lot of folks realize this, but folks who are able to sell at their local farmers market or do farm direct sales on a half-acre lot in a city or an acre, these kinds of things. Maybe even a greenhouse or a series of greenhouses in a very large yard. So we're trying to create an opportunity for folks. Right now, folks like that are paying extremely high taxes on, essentially residential property rates when they're doing this. Or if they're leasing land, they're bearing a very high lease cost because of the tax rate that the property owner is actually paying. So what we're trying to do is encourage folks who are engaging in this kind of urban agriculture to hopefully get a lower lease rates, lower tax rates for the time that they're committed to agriculture. We think the 5-year agreement is a nice way to provide at least some sense of certainty, where both the local government has a certainty of, we know this is a 5-year agreement in terms of our budgeting. The landowner has a 5-year agreement with a farmer has a 5-year agreement with a landowner. So hopefully that 5-year commitment pieces provide some certainty around some of these opportunities. Sometimes urban farming is where folks who are going to become farmers on a larger scale often get their start or cut their teeth. So, we think it's a neat opportunity, and it's a way in particular, if lower income parts of the state in urban areas, this could be something that a city or a county uses as a tool to try to incentivize some growing of food in those areas and hopefully some economic activity around it as well. I guess the last thing I would say is, it's still going to be, though we've used the broad definition of farm use and agricultural production, local cities and counties would still retain the ability to have whatever restrictions they may have. So, for example, you can't raise water buffalo in the city, sort of thing. Like that would still be a local jurisdiction could still have those kinds of standards in place, and so we're not trying to trump any sort of local control in that respect.
Senator Boquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could you go back to the B5? This has been across the House floor through 2 agricultural policy committees, and I don't want to touch the Measure 91 committee with a 10-foot pole, but I see, according to the staff measure summary in my read of the A5s, it is a significant policy decision to reverse what other committees and how they define agricultural production. I don't see this as a technical change at all. Is there some reason the base bill as is will not work?
Chair Haas, Senator Boquist. So the Senate Policy Committee did adopt the amendment that included the restriction so that you could not apply this to the growing, harvesting, and processing of marijuana. So that substantive decision was made through the amendment in the Senate Environment and Natural Resources Committee. What the B5 does simply changes how that is actually dealt with, so it's sort of a technical way. So, and this is really an issue, I don't know if someone from the Farm Bureau is here to explain it, but essentially a concern that because it's going to be an acceptable agricultural crop, the way that this was written, just wanted to be written in a slightly different way so that it could be not, clear that it's we're not excluding a crop that is ostensibly legal from being an accepted farm use in this bill. So, although I think it was fairly clear, the original bill, that it only applied to this urban agriculture incentive zone and not beyond that, I think that's fairly clear, and there was some discussion in the Senate Policy Committee. The B5 amendment is just meant to accommodate that concern and sort of place that restriction on applying this tax break to those operations just in a different way, and to discuss it in a different way in the bill. So that's my best explanation, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. I appreciate that. I just point out, I don't know what is and is not going to be on Measure 91 and how this is all going to unfold. So my eyebrows are raised on the A5 only because I don't have the experience of sitting on Measure 91 or the policy committees for agriculture to figure out what they did or did not intend.
But this amendment that's before us was, from what I understand, a technical fix to the amendment that was put in the previous committee.
Chair House, that's correct. And I would just simply add that, so at least one senator on the Measure 91 committee was on the policy committee, had some questions, and just clarified the legislative intent that we're not trying to restrict anything the Measure 91 committee or the voters have done. It's merely what this tax break may be applied for, what types of crops. So in this case, I think that there is a lot of discussion about actually figuring out the right tax rate for marijuana, and it seemed that it would not be the right place to try to add a tax break, if you will. So that was essentially the legislative intent. There's really around the taxation, not the larger question about whether you can or can't grow marijuana in a city inside of city limits or some sort of urban area.
So with this bill having gone through the natural resources and ag committees, it hasn't been reviewed by revenue impact, kind of that side until now. So it's an unusual situation. It's kind of the inverse of our land use policies that encourage cities to infill, so we protect farmland and timberland to grow outside. But now we're through this sort of saying no, it's okay to do farms inside an urban growth boundary as well. The actual revenue implications, I understand from this, are minimal, Kyle, and can you explain why that is if we have essentially farm deferrals on some of this land?
Yes, Mr. Chair. So, there are a few differences between farmland special assessment under the current statute and under this statute that was discussed by the proponent. But some of it is just there's farm special assessment has kind of clawback provisions already in place. So there's a few different qualification characters. But it's a permissive. The underlying reason for no impact on revenue, it is permissive to the cities or the counties and what they want to do. I do have an example to try to articulate what the potential impact on revenue could be if a city or a county does allow this on a property or a larger scale. And it does, it's in the impact explanation of the revenue impact statement. It kind of walks through. If you look at averages of, say, residential property, the assessed value is generally going to be between 60 and 90% of its real market value. So it's going to depend upon county or city location. Now, on the farmland, for a farmland specially assessed, you would see something more like 1.5% to 5% would be the assessed value, so the value to which tax rates are applied. So if you compare those two, using kind of an average between the 60 to 90% and the 1.5 to 5%, if we're using a hypothetical piece of unimproved land, that's $100,000. If it's residential unimproved land, assessed value would be about $75,000 or so. For the farmland, for the land, if it meets the special assessment under this bill, you have assessed value about $3,200. Using a standard tax rate of $15 per $1,000, the difference in the tax bills would be about $1,100 for the residential improved land compared to $50 for the specially assessed. So that kind of gives a scope of what the impact could potentially be if a county or city adopts this provision.
Aren't we not to get too ethereal about land use policies, but aren't we then creating this sort of inverse thing where we're encouraging people to build in the cities and farm outside? But now with this, ostensibly, aren't we encouraging through the tax breaks farming inside? And won't that have an effect on the infill needs, and I'm sort of channeling my Thousand Friends of Oregon voice here. That I can hear them saying that. I just, not that that's good or bad one way or the other. It just seems like that would be an argument that could be advanced.
Chair Haas, it's a good question. I mean, that's why we've tried to make clear that this is solely for tax assessment purposes. This isn't a development tool per se, and we think the intent is fairly clear that it's really just about the taxation. This really does not stop any land from being developed. It doesn't take any land out of buildable land inventories. It doesn't require changes to urban growth boundaries. As noted already, lands inside of urban areas can get a special assessment for agriculture. It just takes a longer time to get there, and there have been some challenges, in fact, in how that's actually played out. We think this is sort of a better model, frankly, because it's discrete 5-year agreements that can be revisited at 5-year intervals. So that may be perhaps a better. It may turn out to be. It's sort of structured as a pilot in a way because it's got a sunset, but we think it could actually be a different and perhaps preferable alternative long term. It also only applies to the land being used. Like, let's say you have a large lot that's a 1/4 acre in size, but you're only growing food on 10,000 square feet. The special assessment would only be available for the 10,000 square feet, not the entire property. So that's one clarifying point. But back to your land use question, while this certainly encourages agriculture inside urban areas, this does not trump the potential for those lands to be ultimately developed. And I think on paper would still, if a vacant lot owner in town, in a city, had a development proposal, I think in the end it would likely pencil out a lot better than allowing a small-scale farm to occur on that land. And so that's why these agreements can be broken. And there's the only thing you would face is that as a clawback provision that these agreements are broken. So it really, again, I just want to underscore, we believe it has no effect on whether or not a land can be built, and it's solely for the tax rate while it's being farmed, not as a deferment tool for future development. That would be ultimately the choice of a landowner, and I think that they would still be making that decision based on their own economic interests or values rather than some sort of potential restriction here.
Yeah.
Senator Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can see a situation where cities have complaints about these agricultural zones, and after we pass this bill, they're now allowed to say, "Oh, but the legislature did it. It's not our fault." I'm concerned about public notice and public hearings, which I don't see anything about in here. What was that ever brought up in the other committees?
Chair Haas, Senator Riley, that's partly why we have this as a local option. So ultimately, there would be a local decision, like an ordinance or a city council, county commission decisions, which we believe would be open to public review, scrutiny, all the normal procedures that an ordinance or a government agency decision would require. So essentially, we're not just saying that this is anything goes anywhere. There would still be a local decision on whether or not to create these zones, and what we do specifically address is that local rules. While we allow, we want to make clear that. In the broad sense, all legal existing agricultural uses qualify. That does not prevent the ability of a city or county to have other local rules that might be more restrictive. For example, if a city had a restriction on the number of poultry that you could have, or if a city had a restriction on how many beehives, or I used the water buffalo example, those would still be part of it. That would be the local decision, whether through ordinance or through a city council, county commission decision. So we think there's that local nexus, that local decision-making power that would allow those decisions to play out locally, and as we believe the local community could support or oppose if it came up. So I don't believe, that folks would point the finger at the legislature and say, you forced this on us. That's certainly not the intent, and that's not, I don't think, the practical reality of the bill. Though I understand
Sorry for laughing,
concern.
but when you say you don't believe people are going to point their finger at the legislature,
I think they'd point their finger at the local city council or county commission. So.
Okay. Follow up quietly. It's just, I just want to get on the record that I think that, before any local city or county does this, they need to have public hearings and public notice. And a legislature, I don't believe, at least this legislator, is not intending this to allow them to get away from doing that.
Okay. Senator Boquist.
Mr. Chair, and it's just as a comment, it's not for answering of any questions, but, you know, as I read this, the tax policy I don't have a problem with. It's just that there was a significant policy done in our Natural Resource Committee. The chair that normally sits to my left is on that committee. I don't know why they made the policy decision in terms of definitions of agricultural production. I have no idea. I'm not involved in Measure 91, but the A5 amendment does reverse whatever reason that policy was made for and change it around. I don't have a problem with the tax policy, but I'm certainly not one of those people to wade into the middle of that policy without at least some guidance from the previous committee of why they did it, an explanation of why they did it. No one, I don't recall, if they did, I apologize, somebody coming to me and discussing this. And again, I don't even want to get in the middle of the marijuana discussion. But I do not see the A5 as a technical change at all. It is a policy change of definition that's in the natural resources. I don't know whether it's good or bad, one way or the other. And the chair has stepped out to testify elsewhere, so we can't even ask him why they did or did not do this. So if the committee wants to do something, I'm fine voting no all the way down the line until I find an answer. Or I'm fine till somebody carry it over or whatever. It's your choice, Mr. Chair. And somebody says, okay, this is why we did it. But I certainly don't want to step on the toes of the other policy committee who is much smarter in agriculture. And certainly I have 1% knowledge of marijuana, and that's from the bills I'm reading, just for the record, not from smoking or anything. So I don't know any of this or the answers. Your choice, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Ivan, thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else wish to testify on House Bill 2723? Representative Klim, I see you in the back row. No, it's not necessary. It's not necessary. Okay. I'm going to close the public hearing on House Bill 2723. I'm going to move to open up a work session on the Senate Bill 663. We have just about everybody mad at us about this bill, so I think we're doing a good job. I think we're moving forward, and I'd like to get the Legislative Counsel, Mark Mayer, here to take some questions that have come up regarding the -16 amendments and maybe some previous amendments. And I guess first I want to take some questions from our committee, and then perhaps from others, health authority and perhaps counties, and just kind of see where we are here, and do this openly, do this in a committee setting. Mazen, did you have anything you wanted to refresh us on or update us with on the -17s?
I haven't seen the 17s.
16s.
16s.
Jeez.
17s are on deck.
Do we have 17s?
Are they?
Then I might, maybe I shouldn't say anything.
Maybe I should resign, Mr. Chair.
No, I'm good, Mr. Chair.
Really?
Senator Boquist?
Mr. Chair, I think it would be helpful, because just to clear the deal, to ask our good legislative counsel to walk through each section briefly and outline it, and then we can ask questions and make clarifications. And then, as you said, because there seems to be some confusion in the ranks of government, at least on the government side, legislative and executive branch, to make sure everybody clearly understands what it is we think we're saying and what the intent is. So I would simply ask that Mr. Mayor be given the opportunity to walk through each of the sections briefly, and then I suppose we could wait to the end and then go back and ask questions for clarification. Because I know there's been a considerable amount of discussion back and forth between agencies, other people, proponents, opponents, so on and so forth, and it's just a matter of clarity so that everybody understands the legislative intent, and then it becomes policy decisions. Are you amenable with that?
I am amenable with that. Are you okay to do that? You want to start off with preemption?
Yes, Chair Haas, members of the committee, my name is Mark Mayer, Deputy Legislative Counsel. I worked on this particular draft from the very beginning to this point. The draft currently places licensure in the Department of Revenue, but it leaves inspections for the most part for public health and safety reasons with the Oregon Health Authority for reasons, as this committee knows, that are tied to federal funding and federal grants and other agreements that have been entered into with the federal government by the health authority. So that's why there's kind of a split in the powers that have been delegated here. The first section of this is about licensure. I do want to make a comment that the heading on the first page is inaccurate now. Our editorial staff and myself did not catch that. The operative date for this particular bill is now January 1, 2017, but that is something that we can fix on engrossment because it is not a substantive error on our part. The first thing is definitions for the licensure scheme. We tie those into ORS 431840 for both electronic cigarettes and for tobacco products. That definition for inhalant delivery system, and the layman term for that is electronic cigarette. That is now law because the governor did sign House Bill 2546. And so the minute the governor signed that, I started referencing the new law that had been enacted. Section 2, licensure requirement, simply says that a person may not make a retail sale of a tobacco product or an inhalant delivery system in this state unless they have a license. And then it moves on to say that the governing body of a city or county may not adopt an ordinance, and this is the preemption clause, number 1, that requires a person to have a license issued by the city or county to make a retail sale of a tobacco product or inhalant delivery system in addition to the license required by this section. There has been some confusion about the broadness of the application of this. There has been an idea out there this would prohibit the licensing of these establishments through general business licensure schemes, and our office's opinion, and this is actually written very narrowly, to have a license to make a retail sale of a tobacco product or inhalant delivery system in addition to the license required by this section. So, in other words, very narrowly, a city or county cannot require an additional license to make this type of sale, period. I think that most contention is around paragraph B. In that particular preemption clause reads, that imposes a restriction on a qualification for licensure for purposes of making retail sales of tobacco products or inhalant delivery systems that are not authorized by or pursuant to the statutory laws of this state. And there has been some confusion around the words qualification for licensure. Qualification is not defined in the bill. Absent a statutory definition, the courts will look toward the plain meaning of a term as well as the meaning of the term in the context of the legislative scheme in which it takes place. Plain meaning of qualification is, reading from the legislature's adopted dictionary, a condition or standard that must be complied with for the attainment of a privilege. So here the privilege, of course, is to make these sales, these types of sales. And the word qualification means basically the meeting of a condition or standard that must be complied with. So what are those conditions and standards? If you look further down in the page on section 4, very specifically, and again, the court's going to look not only at the plain meaning, but the meaning of the word in the context of the statutory scheme. Line 18 on page 2, to be qualified for licensure under this section, a premises may not be a premises that is mobile and may not be located at the same address as a residence. So the statutory scheme very specifically targets where a licensed premises may be located through these two provisions. Very narrowly read, it would only be these two provisions, but then that would not make sense to have the preemption clause because that would preempt anyway. More broadly read, and this is probably where a court would find that this particular, this is how a court would probably find that this particular reading between these two provisions takes place. This speaks directly to locational standards within this particular provision. If you want to just back up and say, well, what then can a county or city actually adopt? If you think about it loosely in terms of time, place, and manner restrictions, place seems to be addressed in this statutory scheme. Time and manner are not. So county would still be able to do bans on flavors or other types of manner restrictions on how they may be sold, limiting couponing, things like that. Also, time may be addressed, but place seems to be directly addressed within this particular statutory scheme. Section 4 also lays out very basic provisions for how licensure will occur, and it gives the Department of Revenue broad authority to adopt appropriate procedures. Page 3, Section 5, lines 14 through 17, proof of licensure must be posted. Section 6, discipline. Department of Revenue may revoke or suspend or refuse to renew a license issued under Section 4 of this 2015 Act. Very standard language here. There is an ask by the Department of Revenue, and I think I'll just bring it up right now, for a slight deviation from the language in that their general processes allow for a 90-day appeal, but they have a carve-out for cigarette wholesalers, which is only a 30-day appeal, and I believe that the Department of Revenue has asked for the similar carve-out for this particular process here. Again, this works legally, but it doesn't quite match the wholesaler appeals process for a determination of revocation or suspension. Page 4, we also give Department of Revenue in this particular bill on page 4 at the bottom of Section 6 civil penalty power over somebody who violates a law of a tobacco law for purposes related to taxation. So we've kind of split the civil penalties. Public health and safety is going to be handled by health authority, taxation by Department of Revenue. The bill also contains general language about creating a suspense account, rules, and an intergovernmental agreement between the Department of Revenue and Oregon Health Authority, hopefully in order to assist the two as they conduct inspections and enforce the laws that have been delegated to them. On page 5, inspections effective on passage, we have removed language relating to current inspections that the health authority is authorized to conduct, and we have replaced it with language that's a little bit broader in authority in some ways, but also directs them to perform inspections in a particular way. I think I'll just read very briefly from page 6, line 6. Health authority may inspect a premises to ensure compliance with a state or local law or rule or federal law or regulation that governs the retail sale of tobacco products or inhalant delivery systems. It gives them broad authority for inspection powers for public health and safety purposes. And the authority on lines 9 to 11, the authority may enter into one or more agreements with state or federal agencies for the purpose of conducting inspections under this section. So again, broader authority to enter into agreements for the conducting of the inspections. We've also limited or given them some direction that the inspection should be uniform and cost-effective to the extent practicable, and that the authority shall minimize the number of agreements that it enters into pursuant to subsection 2 of this section to the extent practicable. So hopefully only an amount of agreements that is necessary. Section 11, we've replaced the general civil penalty provision that currently exists in law with a new civil penalty provision for public health and safety purposes. We've capped all civil penalties that relate to that do not relate to sales for persons under 18 at $1,000 per violation. In subsection 3, for sales to persons under 18 years of age, the authority shall, and then there's a schedule for the violations that matches the current schedule for selling to minors underneath that the FDA imposes. We do have, at the bottom of page 7, line 30, the authority may not impose a civil penalty against a person if the United States Food and Drug Administration has previously imposed a civil penalty, so no double jeopardy. If the FDA imposes a civil penalty, the authority, for that specific violation, the authority cannot. And then again, some pretty standard language throughout here on where the money's going to go and how it's going to be used. At the bottom of page 8, preemption effective on passage. Again, the operative date for this particular bill, as I mentioned earlier, is now January 1, 2017, so it's going to kick in on that date. But we have created this so that this will become effective on the effective date of the bill. An E clause has been removed from the bill, so the effective date is now January 1, 2016. Some of the discussion around the gap between now and January 1, 2016 is, what's the effect of this preemption language on an existing local ordinance that would otherwise be preempted? The effect is that at the time that this becomes adopted, or at the time that this becomes effective, January 1, 2016, the preemption language would apply to those local ordinances. It does not matter that they were adopted prior to January 1, 2016. I was talking with some people about this a little bit earlier. What this preemption language cannot do is go back in time and retroactively repair, for instance, someone who is denied being established in a certain area under a local ordinance that existed at that time. So, for instance, let's say there's a local ordinance that says can't have a cigarette store within 1,000 feet of a school. That ordinance, January 1, 2016, is preempted by this language. Doesn't matter it was adopted earlier. It will be preempted. What the preemption language cannot do is retroactively go back and handle that denial of that person's establishment of their store at that time. That person can reapply underneath the new scheme as it would be preempted, but it cannot go back and repair that particular situation. So that is how this cannot go back retroactively. Local ordinances will be preempted upon January 1, 2016. And then real briefly, we repeal a section of law that's kind of folded into this other stuff. I do want to say that there has been some confusion between our office and the health authority on two provisions of law that aren't necessarily about inspections, but they tie certain monies to OSP. And I will take the fault for this, not following it up and getting it in there, but ORS 181, 428, and 430 require sharing of monies between OSP and the health authority for tobacco inspection purposes. We handled the language that specifically said you have to agree to enter into an agreement with OSP or law enforcement agencies for inspections, but we didn't get these two statutes. If the committee is willing to entertain a conceptual amendment, I could write them into the bill currently to handle that one outstanding issue here.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Maybe before we get to that, one question. We've got some other questions up here. On the contracting out, can you talk about what OHA could do in terms of contracting out, whether that's who they're limited to contract out with? Could it be other counties? How does that work? There seems to be some confusion.
Right. The current language specifically states that they can enter into an agreement with let's see here, may enter into one or more agreements with state or federal agencies for the purpose of conducting inspections. So the language affirmatively authorizes them to enter into these types of agreements. It does not specifically address entering into agreements with local public health authorities in this draft.
Should it say that?
Well, that would be a policy decision. It has been in some other drafts.
But without that, does that prohibit them from entering into those kinds of agreements?
My reading would be no, because this is permissive language and that they would still be able to do that underneath their general powers. But I understand that there is some desire to have that affirmative language written in. But they should have the general power to do that outside of this anyway.
Okay, thank you. Senator Boquist.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got 3 or 4 items just for clarification, so council can read. Section 1, definitions, just for the record, inhalant delivery system, this A16 and 663 would impact vape shops, and they would have to be licensed. Is that correct?
Correct.
Follow up, Mr. Chair. And then in addition, there's no language in here that addresses for or against sampling. That would need to be addressed in another amendment or in another bill someplace else if that was a policy change.
Correct. That was in some earlier amendments, and it has come out of this particular amendment.
Okay. In terms of the top of page 2, just to clarify, as you pointed out, the qualification, the narrow sense of qualification is the location issue in terms of where you could locate these. And so the preemption basically sets location as a state policy versus a local government policy.
That would be our office's reading of the way the bill is currently structured.
Thank you. In the discipline section in section 6, just once again, the revenue may revoke, so on and so forth like that. Could you explain how any relationship may or may not work for the revocation of a license between OHA and the Department of Revenue?
Well, licensure revocation and suspension is completely within the power of the Department of Revenue underneath this current draft. So OHA does not have any power to revoke or to suspend. In that intergovernmental agreement language, we did direct them to share information related to their investigations as well as to any proceedings that they may have that stem out of those investigations. So if OHA has a contested case hearing to impose a civil penalty, they can share that information with Department of Revenue the way this is currently drafted, and then the Department of Revenue may use that for their own proceedings.
Sure. And in terms of that in relationship to the intergovernmental agreement, so is there anything that prevents OHA and DOR from entering into agreement of how to deal with those proceedings or revocations? And can they share funds? Can they enter into an intergovernmental agreement to share funds if necessary? I assume intergovernmental agreements, those I've seen, have money attached to them.
Right. So to your first question, this specifically requires them to enter into an agreement for the sharing of information necessary for the effective administrations of the Act. So it's pretty specific on, this one is about the sharing of information and not the sharing of funds. We would need some affirmative language to allow funds from the licensing to move over to help pay for the inspections underneath the way that this is drafted. So inspections in this particular amendment would have to be funded as they're currently funded underneath current law. The licensing monies aren't going to slush over. For the second piece, the revocation and the suspension, again, DOR has to handle those proceedings, but if there are other proceedings that occur for other purposes that OHA handles, they can pass the evidence that was presented before an administrative hearing and that sort of thing. They can pass that along over to DOR, and that may help establish a record.
Sure. In terms of basically page 6, the licensing deal, the intent has been in the discussion that we've had every single time in this hearing that I know of course, has not been voted in a work session, is that we have at one point upwards of 6 proposed or actual inspection programs. It's been the intent to try and merge these into a single effective program, and this draft chooses OHA to do that. That is inclusive of their non-violating inspections, their violating inspections, and their effort to acquire the FDA program, which has some $400,000 to $800,000 attached to it. In your opinion, does the language in the licensing here, in which we're trying to tell them to consolidate, merge, so on and so forth, is that intent? That's our intent. Is that conveyed in the language here?
For public health and safety purpose inspections, absolutely. For the tax piece, DOR is completely handling that in this draft, but for the type of inspections that you're talking about, with regard to public health and safety, cells to minors and that sort of thing, yes, because OHA is completely in charge of those types of inspections underneath this draft, and they're directed to try to perform those in a uniform and cost-effective manner.
And in terms of the uniform costs, so on and so forth, double jeopardy, just for the record, my understanding of the draft here is that, in theory, in meeting the goals and the intent, if this were passed and OHA merged the FDA inspections and they became the lead inspection in the state apparatus funded by the federal government, that if the state issued a violation during an inspection process, that would be the violation. They could not do an FDA, and if the FDA issued it, it would be a single one. But however, if there was no FDA program and the state was operating independently of the FDA contract, that is where then
the double jeopardy clause comes into play.
Right.
Correct.
I think I have one more question, Mr. Chair, that's on for clarification. This is raised again as a issue in terms of new, and you've addressed this, new ordinance, this, if this were to pass both chambers, it then becomes signed by the governor. There's no emergency clause. There seems to be this concern that there would be there would be a movement of cities and counties or whomever creating new laws between the end of the sine die of this legislature and January 1 of 16. However, I believe you said that if that did in fact happen, and you alluded to that but didn't state it, if that did in fact, and when the preemption came in, it would preempt those out anyway. Is that not correct?
That's correct. The retroactivity piece of this analysis is simply about actions that occurred pursuant to those ordinances prior to the preemption taking place. So the preemption will preempt any existing local ordinance on the date that the bill becomes effective. It cannot retroactively go back and repair and resolve issues that handled pursuant to those local ordinances prior to the effective date of the act. But that's how the retroactivity that's how the retroactive application of this would not be able to occur. So I think that there's a little bit of confusion about retroactivity of law and how it would apply in this situation. It said it can't go back and resolve an issue that's handled under a local ordinance prior to the effective date of the act. On the effective date of the act, the local ordinances are preempted, whether they're adopted prior to January 1 or otherwise.
One final question, Mr. Chair.
Senator Boquist.
I think I heard you say, I hate to say this, I think I heard you say that there are some, there may be, depending on what the committee decides, there may be some minor technical fixes to clean up.
Yep.
Okay.
I know. We can actually resolve one right now if you would like. It wouldn't have an impact on.
I'm not the chair, so I'm.
Well, I think that's a good note to end on. That there may be some cleanup amendments if you're willing, Mark, to do that. And I think there's still some confusion, and I think some of the interpretations are being confused and maybe even misinterpreted. So we'll let this breathe for another day and maybe talk to you again tomorrow.
That'll be fine. Would you like me to prepare another amendment that
I think
that handles the cleanup?
Technical issues, and so we'll be talking throughout the day.
Okay.
Some of those issues that Senator Boquist raised, and we'll try to clear this all up tomorrow.
Did you guys address? That'd be great.
Okay. Thank you for your work on this and on the marijuana measures, which I know is dominating your life. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll close the work session on Senate Bill 663, and we will carry this over till tomorrow. We still have Senate Bill 80 to deal with. We do not have the financial documentation needed to move it, so we are going to take that one up tomorrow as well. Okay? We will adjourn.
Thank you.
So in a nutshell.
But the